what if our entire approach to world peace is fundamentally backward?
That's a huge question to start with.
Right. But seriously, what if for the last 100 years or so, we've basically been trying to treat this chronic systemic disease with, like, a superficial Band-Aid?
Yeah, it's a really jarring thought, mostly because, we are so heavily conditioned to view peace entirely as a political achievement.
Oh, totally. We think of it as a treaty.
Exactly. We imagine peace as this physical document. You sit down, you negotiate, you sign a treaty, maybe you draw a hard line on a map.
Right. You set up a demilitarized zone or something.
Yeah, and then you just declare the problem solved. But I mean, a Band-Aid might stop the visible bleeding for a second, right?
Sure.
But it does absolutely nothing to cure like an underlying infection in the blood. It just hides the symptom while the disease continues to ravage the body underneath.
Well, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are taking you into a source text today that will completely upend how you look at global conflicts.
It really will.
Yeah, we're going to look at the actual function of politics and, honestly, the underlying purpose of human development.
It's a massive paradigm shift.
It really is. So we are unpacking Chapter 2 today. It's titled In the Name of Peace, and it's from a book called Education and Peace, and the author is Maria Montessori.
Okay, so we definitely have to clear the air immediately regarding that name.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because when you hear Montessori, your mind probably jumps straight to, like, early childhood schooling, right?
Right. People think of preschools.
Yeah. I mean, I think of beautifully crafted wooden toys, tiny chairs, kids learning to pour water from little pitchers.
Quiet classrooms with kids working independently.
Exactly. It feels very domesticated, I guess.
Domesticate is a good word for it.
Yeah.
We've inherited this very quaint, highly localized image of her work over the decades.
We really have.
But this specific source text, it reveals Maria Montessori as a profound social philosopher, like a genuine global visionary.
Yeah, the context here is super important. She delivered these ideas as lectures in Europe during the 1930s.
Which is a terrifying time to be talking about peace.
Right. She was writing this against the backdrop of the devastation of the First World War, and she's literally watching the storm clouds of totalitarianism gather for a Second World War.
Yeah, she saw it all happening, and her thesis in this chapter is just staggering.
That one it is?
She basically argues that true global peace cannot ever be achieved through politics.
Like, at all.
At all. She says it is structurally impossible. Peace can only be achieved through a total ground-up restructuring of human development.
Okay, so let's look at what she calls the dual path, because this establishes the crucial difference between what we'd call crisis management and actual lasting peace.
Yeah, the dual path is central to her whole argument.
So Montessori states that peace is a goal reached only through agreement. But the path to get there, it splits into two totally distinct, non-overlapping efforts.
Right. And the first effort is that immediate, really urgent need to resolve conflicts without violence.
Like putting out fires.
Exactly. It's the prevention of war. It's the active de-escalation of immediate threats. And Montessori assigns this task entirely to one specific domain, which is politics.
Okay, so politics is essentially the machinery of conflict prevention.
Yes, just prevention.
I want to use an analogy here to separate these two paths for everyone listening, because it really helped me visualize it.
Oh, go for it.
Okay, so imagine we are all passengers on this massive wooden boat out in the middle of the ocean.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And suddenly the hull gets punctured by a reef.
Oh.
Just a huge hole. Water is pouring in, and we are actively sinking.
A total disaster scenario.
Right. So politics is the frantic effort of everyone grabbing buckets and just bailing water over the side so we don't drown in the next 5 minutes.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and it is exhausting, right? It requires intense negotiation over, like, who gets which bucket, who's bailing too slow, who's in charge of the bucket.
Well, absolutely. And it is absolute crisis management.
Yeah. But it keeps the boat afloat.
Well, it keeps it afloat for 1 more hour, maybe 2. But the thing is, you can bail water for eternity, You can exhaust every resource you have, and you still haven't actually fixed the hull.
Right.
You are permanently trapped in a state of crisis, mistaking the act of barely surviving for the act of sailing.
That's exactly it. Mistaking surviving for sailing. Which brings us to the second path on Montessori's dual track.
The more important path, according to her.
Right. Because while the politicians are furiously bailing the water, someone needs to actually be doing the foundational work of repairing the hole in the hull.
So the boat stops taking on water altogether.
Exactly. And that long-term structural effort to establish a permanent, durable peace. Montessori says that is the exclusive domain of education.
And this is where we have to really look at how humanity currently operates, because we pour nearly all of our global resources, all our attention, and basically our collective anxiety into the people bailing the water.
Oh, completely. We watch the daily news just to monitor how fast they are bailing.
Yes. We hold these massive elections to swap out the people holding the buckets. But Montessori points out that preventing a conflict is not the same thing as building peace.
Politics is prevention. Education is construction.
That's the core distinction.
But, okay, I have to pause here and challenge this framework a little bit.
Sure.
Because when I hear the word education, my brain just defaults to sitting in a classroom.
Like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, like memorizing the dates of the French Revolution or learning the Pythagorean theorem, maybe dissecting a frog in biology.
Standard schooling stuff.
Right. So if politicians are failing to stop wars, how does me memorizing historical dates or learning algebra fix the hole in the boat? I guess I just fail to see the mechanism connecting classroom curriculum to global peace.
Well, and that is the critical distinction we need to make regarding Montessori's specific definition of education.
Okay, clarify that for me.
Because she states explicitly in the text that constructive education for peace must not be limited to mere schooling.
Mere schooling, okay.
Yeah. If you view education simply as, the transfer of academic data from a teacher's brain into a student's notebook, you miss her entire philosophy.
So what is education to her then, if it isn't just schooling?
She defines it as this massive, collective, human-wide effort aimed at the internal transformation of the individual.
Internal transformation.
Yes. It is not about teaching a child how to read solely so they can get a job, pay taxes, and participate in a localized economy.
Right, which is how we usually view it.
Education to her is about helping humanity understand its own mission. It's about illuminating what she calls the unseen social mechanisms that govern our lives.
Unseen social mechanisms.
Right. The things that govern our material interests and really our ultimate survival as a species.
You know, that phrase unseen social mechanisms feels like the hinge of this entire argument. What exactly are these mechanisms we are failing to see?
Well, she argues that we fail at achieving peace because we are basically functionally ignorant of the environment we've built.
Ignorant how?
We don't understand the complex, invisible machinery of our own civilization. It's like we are operating a massive, highly volatile machine without knowing what the buttons do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we're still acting on primitive instincts while operating it. Therefore, true constructive education for peace requires this profound awakening to our current physical reality.
Okay, so she points out that the most characteristic phenomenon of modern life is a radical shift in our social conditions, right?
Yes.
Like we have to wake up and look at the world as it actually exists today rather than how it existed, say, 300 years ago. And she divides this shift into two distinct levels.
Right. And the first level is pretty obvious to everyone. It's the external scientific changes.
The stuff we can see.
Exactly. Our physical environment has been entirely transformed by science and technology. We see the airplanes, the skyscrapers, modern medicine, the instant communication grids.
Yeah, it's the flashy, tangible stuff. We all acknowledge the technology.
But the second level is deeper. It's foundational, and it's largely invisible. And this is the real crux of her argument regarding our modern reality.
Which is what?
Underneath all that flashy technology, the economic mechanisms and the networks of communication have physically united human material interests.
Okay, let's make sure we clarify something really important here.
Yeah.
She isn't making a moral plea here, is she?
Not at all.
Like, she isn't saying, hey, guys, we should all hold hands and get along because it's the nice thing to do.
No, she is stating a cold, biological, and economic fact.
Right.
The material interests of a person living in Tokyo are now inextricably, permanently linked to the material interests of a person in Buenos Aires, London, or Nairobi.
The shift has already happened.
Exactly. The invisible social mechanisms she's talking about are the global supply chains, the shared ecological systems, the intertwined financial markets.
It's already fully integrated.
We just haven't updated our mindset to reflect this physical reality. And because our internal mindset lags so far behind our external reality, we just continue to act as if we are isolated nations with opposing zero-sum interests.
And she warns that if we continue to see ourselves merely as parts of competing nations, rather than interconnected parts of a united whole, we are mathematically doomed to self-destruction.
Mathematically doomed, yeah.
And she brings historical receipts to prove this, which I found fascinating. She looks at the aftermath of World War I as the ultimate proof that the old rules of geopolitics have just completely vanished.
This is a really powerful part of her argument.
Yeah, let's walk through her logic here regarding the obsolescence of war. Because historically, like in the ancient world, war actually made a brutal, twisted kind of economic sense, didn't it?
Unfortunately, yes, it did.
Right. One empire attacks another, they steal their gold reserves, annex their fertile land, and take their population as slave labor.
Right, the victor gets materially richer and physically stronger.
And the losers literally wiped off the map. I mean, it was a horrific system, obviously, but it's a mathematically functional business model for the conqueror.
It was a system of direct acquisition. War was a genuinely viable strategy for a nation-state looking to expand its power back then. But Montessori points out that World War I proved definitively that war has completely lost its material meaning.
Why?
Because the victors of World War I did not actually gain new strength or wealth.
Right. If you look at the historical reality of that conflict, the Allied powers won, technically, but they were left economically devastated.
Completely bankrupted.
Yeah, carrying massive debts with an entire generation of their workforce buried in trenches. And what happened to the defeated nations?
This is where the old rules break down.
Because they didn't just disappear into the ether. They didn't become a neat little prize to be packed away in a treasury. Montessori's text points out that we encountered a completely new phenomenon in human history right there.
The conquered nation became a disease that afflicted all of humanity. Disease is the absolute perfect word for the specific mechanism she is describing. In a modern, interconnected world, a defeated, economically ruined nation becomes a systemic threat to everyone else.
You can't just ignore them.
Exactly. The victor can't just plunder the capital and walk away. If a defeated nation collapses into hyperinflation, anarchy, or total poverty.
Which is exactly what happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany.
Right. It creates a massive economic vacuum. And that vacuum disrupts global trade, it breeds extremism, and ultimately, it pulls the victors down with it.
So it's basically like an autoimmune disorder of the global body.
That's a really good way to frame it.
Like, if the global economy is a single shared bloodstream, destroying Germany's economy in the 1920s was like injecting a pathogen directly into that shared circulatory system.
Yes.
The victors actually had to turn around, spend immense resources, and try to help the defeated nation get back on its feet because, well, a rotting room in your house eventually collapses the entire structure.
And this brings up an analogy from her text that is incredibly visceral. I mean, it really sticks with you.
Oh, the arm analogy, yes.
Montessori states that in this modern, hyper-connected reality, destroying another nation for your own material gain is functionally identical to taking a blade and cutting off your own right arm.
Wow.
Just slicing it off, under the delusional, psychotic hope that doing so will magically make your left arm twice as strong.
Which is insane. I mean, you look at an individual cutting off their own arm and instantly recognize it as a psychiatric emergency.
Immediately. You would say you are actively destroying your own body.
Right. And Montessori's looking at international war and declaring it the exact same psychiatric emergency, just playing out on a macro geopolitical scale.
Because we are no longer separate bodies. That is the revelation she is just desperately trying to force us to see. We have become what she calls humanity as an organism.
Humanity as an organism. And we need to stress here, for you listening, that she does not mean this as a metaphor.
No, not at all.
Or some kind of poetic, spiritualized, wishful thinking. She means it as a tangible, structural reality.
A literal biological superorganism.
Exactly.
She writes that the superstructure of human effort, which has been, building, layering, and compounding since the dawn of history, is now complete.
It's done.
The nervous system of global communications has been laid down. The circulatory system of international economics is pumping resources across oceans right now.
So a new entity has actually been born.
Yes. The unified human organism. We are living as cells inside this massive singular body right now.
Okay, so if we accept this premise, if we acknowledge that we are biologically and economically functioning as a single global organism right now, the artificial lines we draw on maps suddenly look profoundly absurd.
They look ridiculous.
We spend endless resources defending borders that the actual economy and the flow of information simply ignore on a daily basis.
And those borders become not just outdated, but incredibly dangerous, which leads perfectly into the next layer of her philosophy.
Okay, let's get into it.
Because if the whole world is a single body, What does that make the individuals living inside it?
Like, what does it make us?
Right. What does it make you listening to this deep dive right now? Montessori points to the, quote, miraculous powers that modern humans possess.
And we should remind everyone, keep in mind she wrote this nearly a century ago, yet her descriptions feel incredibly current.
Very current. She lists our capabilities almost as if she is cataloging the powers of a mythological pantheon.
Yeah. She says today humans fly higher and more securely than the eagle.
Right.
We have harnessed the invisible, secret energies of the universe. Our voices can physically cross oceans in an instant. We can capture the music of the entire world and play it back perfectly.
We have mastered the transmutation of matter itself.
It's wild to think about it in those terms.
I want you, the listener, to just pause and ground this in your immediate reality for a second. You are likely holding a small pane of glass and metal right now that is silently pulling invisible electromagnetic waves out of the sky.
Decoding them into high-fidelity audio.
Exactly, and projecting the voices of two people who aren't even in the room with you. If you transported a person from the 12th century into your living room and showed them this device,
They would fall to their knees.
they would view you as a literal sorcerer wielding power that transcends the natural order.
But here is where I have to push back hard on Montessori's framework.
Okay, push back.
Let's say I acknowledge these godlike technological powers, right? I am holding this smartphone. I can fly across the Atlantic in a few hours. That's all true.
Right.
But my identity isn't just a byproduct of my technology.
What do you mean?
Well, I am deeply proud of my cultural heritage. Like, whether you are Dutch or American or Japanese or Kenyan, your national identity is tied to shared history, language, art, and specific localized values.
Sure, of course.
So how does Montessori reconcile the fact that we possess these universal powers, but still deeply, and perhaps rightfully, identify with geographically confined specific cultures?
That's a great question, and she actually draws a very sharp distinction between cultural heritage and the political apparatus of the nation-state.
Okay, so she's separating the two.
Yes. She does not advocate for the erasure of human culture. The text includes a vital caveat acknowledging that local families, communities, specific languages, and deep-rooted cultural traditions will always exist.
And they add to the richness of the human experience.
Exactly. She isn't demanding a dystopian future where we all wear identical jumpsuits and speak a single, newly invented global language.
Well, thank goodness, that sounds terrible.
Yeah, the culture remains. What she rigorously condemns is the political nation-state.
Political nation state. Right.
The bureaucratic, militarized entity that claims exclusive rights over a piece of land, hoards resources, and fundamentally positions itself in a zero-sum opposition to other nation-states.
Right.
She argues that it is intellectually and practically ridiculous to think that a human being wielding universal atomic-level power could be contained by the political label of just an Englishman or just an Italian.
Like the container is simply too small for the power we hold.
That's beautifully said, yes. Because of the powers you possess, you are inherently a new citizen of a new world. You are, in her exact terminology, a citizen of the universe.
Citizen of the universe. Wow. That is a massive, incredibly heavy title to place on a person's shoulders.
It is, but the implication of that title is what makes her philosophy so radical.
How so?
She states that in a reality where citizens of the universe exist, the whole concept of political nations with conflicting interests has lost all justification for its existence.
None at all.
None. These sovereign political entities must either integrate entirely into the global organism functioning as cooperative, specialized organs within a single body, or they must completely disappear.
Just vanish.
Vanish. There is no middle ground where isolated, hostile nation-states can survive in a globally integrated nervous system.
That is a staggering ultimatum. Integrate or vanish.
And she uses a specific historical analogy to illustrate how petty and destructive our modern political borders will look to future generations.
Oh, this is such a good analogy. She compares clinging to national borders today to clinging to the mentalities of medieval Italian factions.
Yes.
She specifically mentions the Poleschi and the Piagnoni.
Let's unpack that historical reference for a second because it perfectly illuminates her point regarding the absurdity of localized conflict.
Let's dive into it. So in Florence, Italy, centuries ago, the Piagnoni were the radical, austere followers of the Friar Girolamo Savonarola, while the Poleschi were the staunch supporters of the powerful Medici banking family.
Right. And these weren't just debate clubs, right?
No, these were fierce, armed political factions. They literally murdered each other in the piazzas over municipal control of a single city.
A single city.
To them, the fate of the universe hinged on whether the Poleschi or the Pignoni controlled Florence.
So imagine if someone walked up to you on the street today and passionately declared they were willing to die for the Poleschi faction.
I'd be very confused.
Right. You wouldn't engage them in political debate. You would assume they were experiencing a break from reality.
You'd call for help.
Because the conflict is a historical ghost, it has been entirely swallowed up by the broader integration of Italy and subsequently Europe.
And Montessori is applying that exact lens to our current geopolitical landscape.
Exactly.
She is saying that clinging to the idea that one modern nation must economically or militarily crush another is exactly as absurd. It is medieval factionalism pretending to be sophisticated geopolitics.
Because universal ideas, data, and capital are traveling through the air across borders at the speed of light right now.
Right.
Private groups and political nations trying to hoard these universal forces, trying to claim exclusive ownership over the powers of the universe. She warns that this tribal hoarding will literally tear the global organism apart.
You just cannot put a universal force into a tribal box.
It doesn't fit. When you try to force a globally integrated organism to operate according to the rules of localized tribal warfare, the machine violently breaks down.
Well, this brings us to a massive contradiction that we really have to resolve here. Okay, so we have these godlike powers. We have a united global nervous system of trade and communication. Logically, given our mastery over nature, we should be living in an unprecedented golden age of absolute unity and abundance.
Logically, yes.
So why aren't we? Why are we still acting like isolated, paranoid, warring tribes? Why is there such a catastrophic disconnect between our technological reality and our human behavior?
And this is the core diagnosis of Montessori's essay. This introduces the concept she calls the psychological lag.
The psychological lag. Let's dive deeply into the mechanics of this because I really feel like it explains so much of the anxiety of the modern world.
It absolutely does. Montessori highlights a profound paradox here. We have entirely conquered our external environment. We have overcome the brutal limitations of nature.
Right.
We sit, as she beautifully phrases it, in the seat of Jupiter the Thunderer and the gods of Hellas, the gods of ancient Greece. We summon lightning to light our homes. We fly across the sky. We communicate instantly across the planet.
We're practically gods of the physical realm.
Exactly.
So we've upgraded the hardware of civilization to an unrecognizable degree. But the tragedy is, we never bothered to update the internal operating system of the human mind.
The software is out of date.
Yeah. We are trying to run a vastly complex, globally integrated supercomputer, what Montessori calls the superworld, using a primitive survival mode operating system forged in the Stone Age.
That's a perfect analogy.
We are trying to process an infinite, interconnected reality through a psychological code that essentially says, fear the outsider and hoard the limited resources. And because of this mismatch, the human psyche is just crashing.
And Montessori analyzes the immense psychological toll of this crash. Human personality and mindset just haven't evolved fast enough to match our new external powers.
Too fast.
Because man cannot keep up internally with his external progress, he becomes deeply unstable. The cognitive load of the superworld is simply too heavy.
Right.
The text states that as a result, man becomes timid, lost, and dangerously submissive to blind authority.
Okay, submissive to blind authority. That phrase, that really stopped me in my tracks when reading this.
It's a heavy observation.
Especially considering she was writing this in the 1930s during the rise of European fascism. But honestly, it applies equally to authoritarian populism today.
Oh, definitely.
The obvious question is, why do people wielding the power of gods actively seek out a dictator to tell them what to do?
It comes down to the fear of infinite choices, and really the terror of universal responsibility.
The terror of responsibility.
Yeah. When the world is too complex, too vast, and your internal psychology is too primitive to process it, freedom feels terrifying. Having the power of a god is exhausting if you still have the mind of a frightened tribal primate. Submission is a relief.
Oh, wow. Submission is a relief.
Montessori explicitly states that the psychological lag leads to regressions into paganism and barbarism. People willingly hand over their autonomy to a strongman because they are desperate for the simple, brutal certainty of the old tribal rules.
Right. A dictator simplifies the superworld. He tells you exactly who the enemy is, exactly what belongs to you, and exactly what to do.
It takes the cognitive load off.
You know, modern psychologists talk endlessly about the mental health crisis, burnout, and the inferiority complex. The feeling that you are small, inadequate, and unable to cope with the demands of life.
It's everywhere today.
It is. And Montessori basically scales this concept up to a species level. She asks a terrifying question. What happens when the king of the universe develops a severe inferiority complex?
It's a recipe for disaster.
What happens when the creature that controls atomic energy and bioengineering is trembling with fear, chronically depressed, and feeling entirely powerless?
It creates the ultimate highly volatile paradox. We are essentially gods suffering from imposter syndrome.
Gods with imposter syndrome. That is so accurate.
We are still fighting over scraps of material goods and arguing about which social system is superior when we have already practically conquered nature.
We won the game.
We beat the harshness of the natural world. But instead of enjoying the victory and living in abundance, we're using the technological trophy we won to bash each other's brains in.
Because we don't know who we are anymore. We are entirely disconnected from our own reality.
Yes.
So if adults are fundamentally crushed by this superworld, if our internal software is hopelessly corrupted by fear, tribalism, and this profound psychological lag, we clearly cannot rely on adults to build the new world.
No, we can't.
We can't trust the people with the inferiority complexes to fix the broken hull of the boat.
The adult mind is already fully formed around the old, broken paradigm. We need an entirely new engine for human evolution, a new source of psychological code.
And where do we find that?
Montessori states that we must go back to the beginning. We must go back to the child.
Her core declaration in this section is, and I quote, "The child is the source and the key to the enigma of humanity."
It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But she means it as a rigorous scientific pathway out of our current doom.
I am going to push back on this, though, because to a modern geopolitical thinker, this sounds like, well, utopian nonsense.
It really does sound naive at first glance.
Right. I look at the world today. I see nuclear proliferation, entrenched geopolitical warfare, massive economic inequality, and climate change. And Montessori's solution to a world where adults wielding the powers of Jupiter are failing is a child.
Just a child.
Children are helpless. They have no political capital. They have no economic power. How on earth is a child supposed to fix the structural collapse of global civilization?
Well, it only sounds naive if you misunderstand her scientific view of what a child actually is. She isn't suggesting we put an 8-year-old at the head of the United Nations.
Okay, good.
She is pointing out that the child possesses an entirely different internal mechanism than the adult. The child arrives in the world with unrecognized, profoundly untapped powers, sensitivities, and creative instincts.
Walk me through the actual mechanics of this. How does a child's internal mechanism differ from an adult's in a way that actually solves the psychological lag?
Montessori coined a term for it. The absorbent mind.
The absorbent mind.
Yes. An adult learns by actively acquiring information and filtering it through their existing biases, right?
Right. We judge everything we learn.
Exactly. But a child doesn't just learn about their environment, they absorb it entirely, and they use it to physically and psychologically construct their very identity.
Wow.
The child is the builder of the adult. The adult's operating system is already corrupted by the tribal fears we discussed, but the child is infinite potential. They are not born inherently nationalistic.
Right.
They are not born with an inferiority complex regarding the superworld.
So the child is the new, uncorrupted software. But wait, I'm still kind of skeptical here.
What's the hesitation?
Even if a child is born as uncorrupted software, they eventually have to enter the adult world. If they grow up in a broken, hyper-nationalistic system, don't they just absorb that corruption and become the exact same anxious, warring adults?
And that is precisely the tragedy she's identifying. Society, as it functions today, completely stifles the child's natural powers. We take this infinite potential and we immediately force it into the outdated, primitive hardware of our traditional educational and political systems.
We squash it.
Yes, we sit them at desks, demand unquestioning obedience to an authority figure at the front of the room, ring bells to dictate their movements, and grade them on their ability to conform.
It's literally factory training.
We meticulously train them to be anxious, submissive, tribal adults.
We train them to blindly follow orders, which perfectly prepares them to submit to the authoritarian dictators we discussed earlier. You
Exactly.
teach them how to bail water in the sinking boat rather than showing them how to fix the hull.
That's it exactly. And to cure the psychological lag, Montessori argues we must fundamentally alter the entire structure of education from the ground up.
It can't just be tweaking the curriculum.
No, it can no longer be about conforming the child to a broken world. Education must be about providing vast, unprecedented new opportunities for the child's spiritual development.
Okay, I hear the phrase spiritual development, and my brain immediately flags it as either religious indoctrination or vague, meaningless corporate wellness speak.
I get that. It carries a lot of baggage.
What are the actual mechanics of spiritual development in her framework?
It has absolutely nothing to do with religious dogma. Spiritual development, in this specific context, refers to cultivating the inner architecture of the human being.
The inner architecture.
Yes, the development of the will, deep concentration, and natural social cohesion.
So not just memorizing facts.
Far from it. In a genuinely constructive educational environment, children aren't forced to share or artificially mandated to get along by a teacher.
Right.
Through freedom of movement and self-directed work, they naturally develop an internal locus of control. They learn to navigate complex social interactions without an adult constantly dictating the terms.
And they develop confidence in their own agency.
Exactly. Which actively inoculates them against that devastating inferiority complex we were talking about.
They learn to exist as capable citizens of their immediate environment, which eventually scales up to them acting as capable citizens of the universe.
Exactly the progression.
So to achieve this on a global scale, she proposes a concept that is truly breathtaking in its scope. She calls for a global truce.
For the global truce. Yes.
She states that all nations, everywhere, need to come to a mutual understanding, drop their weapons, and declare an absolute halt to the bailing of the water.
Just stop the crisis management entirely.
Right. And the sole exclusive purpose of this global truce is to allow every single nation to redirect all of its energy, its vast wealth, and its focus entirely onto cultivating its own human beings.
She asks us to recognize the total social rights of the child and the adolescent.
She is proposing a world centered entirely around human development.
I mean, just imagine the practical reality of what she is suggesting here.
It's hard to even fathom.
Imagine if the astronomical defense budgets of every nation on Earth, the trillions of dollars spent on weapons meant to destroy the global organism, were suddenly completely reallocated to the holistic, psychological, and physical development of children.
Trillions of dollars.
Imagine if the primary metric for a nation's prestige wasn't its gross domestic product or its nuclear stockpile, but the psychological health, the independence, and the spiritual expansiveness of its next generation.
Okay, but if we actually manage to do this, what is the result? Does it just make people slightly happier, or does it actually solve the geopolitical crises?
Montessori promises the ultimate payoff here. She states that the seemingly insurmountable social problems of our time, the border disputes, the resource wars, the entrenched tribal hatreds, they won't be solved through painful, endless political negotiation.
What happens to them?
They will simply dissolve.
Dissolve.
Yes. They will become entirely irrelevant, just like the blood feuds of the Pulaski and the Piemuni. The new humans running the system, possessing a mindset that actually matches their technological power, won't even compute those old problems.
They will be operating on a completely different level of consciousness.
That's the goal.
And the text describes this transition with an incredibly evocative image. It says that if we center human development, the arrival of peace will feel as sudden, as close, and as effortless as waking up from a dream.
Or, more accurately, snapping out of a hypnotic trance.
A hypnotic trance is exactly what it feels like when you watch the relentless cycle of international news.
Totally.
We are hypnotized by the crisis, transfixed by the frantic bailing of the water, completely forgetting that we have the power, the resources, and the technology to finally fix the boat.
We just have to wake up.
We've covered immense ground today, moving from the failure of politics to the biological reality of our unified world.
It's a lot to process.
We started by realizing that our obsession with preventing war is merely a band-aid. It's a frantic crisis management that completely ignores the chronic disease rotting the hull.
Right.
And we explored how modern technology and global economics have forcefully evolved humanity into a single, unified biological organism, a global body where economically destroying another nation is exactly like cutting off your own arm.
And we examine the terrifying mechanics of the psychological
The
lag.
software glitch.
Yeah, the reality that we wield the powers of gods, but cower in the shadow of the superworld we built, crippled by an inferiority complex that makes us crave the brutal simplicity of authoritarian dictators.
And finally, we looked at the radical structural cure. The only way to update our corrupted psychological software is to declare a global truce and restructure our entire civilization around the spiritual, internal development of the child.
The only entity capable of becoming an uncorrupted citizen of the universe.
You, listening to this, you are navigating this complex superworld every single day. You are carrying the powers of Jupiter in your pocket, communicating across oceans, and participating in a unified global economy.
You are a citizen of the universe, whether your internal software has fully realized it or not.
Which leaves us with a final, practical thought to chew on. Something that Montessori implies, but leaves for us to answer in the reality of our own lives.
What's that?
If we are currently living under a collective hypnotic spell of outdated national rivalries, tribal hoarding, and medieval thinking, what is the very first thing you can do tomorrow morning to prove to yourself that you've snapped out of the trance?
That's a great question.
What does the daily routine of a true citizen of the universe actually look like when they wake up, go to work, and interact with the superworld? Are you going to keep pouring all your anxiety into the people bailing the water, or are you going to start looking for ways to finally cure the disease?
It's completely up to us.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the unseen mechanisms around you. Keep looking beneath the surface of the daily crisis, and we will see you next time.